I knew her coffee order by heart. 1 shot of espresso, splash of oat milk, no sweetener, and if the cup wasn't on her desk within 4 minutes of her walking through the door, I'd hear about it in a tone that didn't raise itself but somehow still cut. That was the job. Learn her rhythms before she had to explain them. Stay 3 steps ahead of what she needed and 2 steps behind where she was actually standing. Her name was Vivian Cole, and she ran the Pacific Northwest division of a mid-size infrastructure firm the way surgeons operate. Clean cuts, no sentiment, nothing wasted. I'd been her assistant for 9 months. In that time, I'd rescheduled her dentist appointment 4 times, talked 2 clients off ledges she didn't have patience for, and once spent 40 minutes on the phone with a hotel in Denver arguing about a corner suite that had been booked under the wrong corporate card. I knew the 12-digit code to her office safe, the name of her college roommate who still called on birthdays, and the fact that she kept a photo of a yellow Labrador in her top desk drawer that she never talked about. What I didn't know, what I told myself I would never have a reason to know, was what she looked like when she was genuinely afraid. Tuesday in October changed that. We were on a small charter flight out of Portland heading to a 3-day conference in Bozeman, Montana. 6-seat Cessna, just the 2 of us and the pilot. The kind of flight that looks efficient on a schedule and feels lonely in practice. Vivian was in the seat across from me, reading a binder I'd put together the night before, 1 ankle crossed over her knee, a highlighter moving at steady intervals. I was updating the attendee contact list on my laptop, trying not to spill the coffee I'd poured from the small thermos I'd brought, because I'd learned early that charter planes didn't always stock what she preferred. Keynote intro runs long, she said without looking up. I pulled up the itinerary. 3 minutes, maybe 4. Cut it to 90 seconds and send the revised notes to the moderator before we land. Already drafted. I'll send it once we're on the ground, and I have signal. She turned a page, said nothing. That was as close to approval as things usually got. The pilot's name was Frank. 50s, calm voice, the kind of guy who made you feel like bad weather was just weather. He'd given us a brief before takeoff that lasted about 45 seconds and covered nothing alarming. The flight was supposed to be 2 hours and change. The Rockies were ahead of us, brown and white through the small oval windows, closer than they looked on the map. About an hour in, the plane shuddered once, quick and light, like a truck hitting a pothole. Vivian's highlighter paused. Then nothing for a minute. Then it happened again, harder this time. Not turbulence exactly. More like something underneath the normal motion of flight, something mechanical and wrong. Frank's voice came through the speaker. Not calm now. Folks, I'm going to need you both to make sure your belts are tight. We've got an issue with one of our systems and I'm working through it. Vivian closed the binder. I pulled my seatbelt tighter, felt the sudden stupid awareness that I had no idea what to do beyond that. The plane banked left, abrupt enough that my shoulder hit the wall. Through the window, the ground below was not flat farmland anymore. It was forest and rock, and the wrinkled brown surface of the Rockies, and there was no runway anywhere in that picture. Frank, Vivian's voice was level, almost conversational. What are we looking at? Working on it, Miss Cole. Stay seated, please. The engine sound changed. I'd never thought about the sound of a plane's engine the way you think about background noise. Until that moment when it went uneven, skipping in a way that made my stomach drop before the plane did. The binder slid off Vivian's lap. She grabbed the armrest with one hand, hard enough that I could see the tendons in her wrist. We're not near any airport, I said, more to myself than her. No, she said, flat, like I'd stated the temperature. Frank said something sharp into his radio, words I couldn't fully make out over the engine. Then the nose tilted. Not dramatically at first, just enough to feel different, wrong, like the angle of everything had shifted by 1 degree too many. Hold on, Frank said. The landing, if you could call it that, was the loudest thing I've ever heard. We clipped something first, a tree or a ridge, and the impact hit sideways, snapping us both hard in our belts. The plane spun a quarter turn on the ground, bouncing off terrain that was not designed to be a runway, and when it stopped fast, and my head hit the seat cushion so hard that for a few seconds the world was just a single ringing frequency. When my vision cleared, smoke was coming from somewhere near the front. Thin, but there. Vivian was still in her seat, belt intact, eyes open, a cut along her forearm, blood running neat and red down to her wrist. She was staring at the front of the cabin with an expression I'd never seen on her. Not panic, not tears, just a kind of absolute stillness, like every system was rerouting. Vivian. I said it before I thought about titles or hierarchy, or the fact that in 9 months I'd never once called her by her first name. She blinked. Looked at me. Can you move? She tested it, shifted, winced. Yes. Then Frank. You. I was already unbelting. I pushed toward the cockpit, which was buckled inward on the left side, the door jammed into its frame at a sick angle. I got it open enough to look through. What I saw I won't describe, except to say that Frank wasn't going to be guiding us out of there, and the radio beside him was bent and dark. I backed away and looked at Vivian. He's gone, I said. She held my gaze for 2 full seconds. Something moved behind her eyes, a fracture, small and fast, and then it closed. What do we have to work with? Asked Vivian. Status report first. Grief later, maybe never. I went through the cabin. 2 bottles of water, a first aid kit under the rear seat, my messenger bag which had my dead phone, a protein bar, a packaged sandwich, a portable battery that had 15% charge left, and a rain jacket. Vivian's carry-on which had more clothes and a charger that was useless without power, an emergency foil blanket tucked into a compartment near the door, a small flashlight. That was it. That was everything between us and whatever was outside. Outside was Montana in October. Forest, mostly. Rock outcroppings visible through gaps in the tree line. The temperature was already cooler than Portland had been, and the sun was moving. We climbed out through the cabin door, which had buckled enough at the frame that I had to kick it twice to swing clear. The ground was uneven, soft in places, frozen in others. The trees around us were dense and tall, Douglas firs mostly, the kind that don't leave a lot of sky above. Here. Vivian stepped out after me and stopped. She looked around the way she looked at a quarterly report when the numbers were bad. Careful, processing, not willing to react until she understood the full picture. Signal? She asked. Checked my phone. The battery pack gave me enough for 30 seconds of life. Nothing. 0 bars. I showed her the screen. She pulled out her own phone. Same. Okay, she said, that was all. Just okay. We moved the supplies away from the aircraft. I'd watched enough survival content at 2 a.m. to know fuel could still catch, even after a crash like this, and I found a flat area about 60 feet away where 2 large boulders created a natural windbreak. It wasn't shelter. It was a direction. Vivian's arm needed attention first. The cut was clean but deep enough to need pressure. I used the gauze from the kit and wrapped it while she sat on one of the boulders, watching me work with the same expression she used when reviewing contracts. Alert, clinical, trusting the process until it proved it couldn't be trusted. Hider, she said. It'll hurt. I know. Do it. I did. She didn't flinch. That was the first thing that surprised me about her out there. The first surprise of many. By late afternoon we'd established the basics. We had water for maybe 2 days if we were careful. Food for one. I'd found a thin creek about a quarter mile downhill. I marked the path carefully, broken branches every 30 feet, and filled both bottles, using the foil emergency blanket as a makeshift filter layer over the mouth of the bottle. It wasn't perfect. We both knew that. We drank anyway. Vivian had stopped giving orders by then, which told me more about how much pain she was in than anything she said. She moved carefully, one arm slightly held away from her body. When I pointed it out, she told me her ribs were bruised, maybe one cracked, and that she'd had worse and it wasn't relevant. It's relevant if you can't breathe in 8 hours, I said. She looked at me. The look she usually gave junior associates who'd spoken out of turn, and then, slowly, she let it go. Sat down. Let me check her breathing, which was shallow but even. You're not going to tell me I'm fine, she said. No. Good. She looked out through the trees. I don't need that right now. The night came on faster than I wanted. I built a rough shelter. Seat fabric from the plane, branches, the foil blanket folded over the top. Against the larger boulder. It looked like something a kid would be embarrassed by. It was the best I could do. Vivian watched me work without commenting, which I eventually understood was her version of approval out here. We split the sandwich and 1 protein bar between us, and sat in the half-dark listening to the forest figure out we were in it. Do you think anyone knows yet? She asked. Flight plan was filed, I said. They'll know we didn't arrive. Search and rescue in Montana is good. They'll start at first light if not before. That's 4 optimistic assumptions in a row. Hey, one of them has to be right. Shh. She made a sound that might have been the beginning of a laugh. It surprised both of us. She covered it quickly, pulled the foil blanket tighter around her shoulders. Shh. I had a dinner tonight, she said. 3 investors, the Meridian Group. Took 4 months to get that table. I know. I booked it. Right. A pause. Cancel it. I don't have signal. Another pause. Then very quietly, I know. That was the first time she sounded like a person instead of a position. I didn't sleep that night. Not really. I dozed in 40-minute pieces and woke each time to check that the shelter was holding and that Vivian was still breathing steadily beside me. Around 3 a.m., she woke up with a sharp intake of breath, hand going to her ribs. Easy, I said. Shh, I'm fine. You moved wrong in your sleep. He settled again, slowly. After a minute, she said in the dark, You know I've been doing this job for 19 years. I didn't say anything. I started as a project coordinator making $42,000 a year in a company that had a ping-pong table and no working printer. Now I run a division with 140 employees and an annual budget that has 9 digits in it. She paused, and the thing I'm thinking about right now is whether I turned off the coffee maker in my kitchen this morning. I looked at her in the dark. Did you? I never leave it on. Then you're fine. She was quiet for a moment. I have a dog, she said, Clementine, golden retriever. My neighbor watches her when I travel. She stopped. She'll be confused when I'm not back tonight. I thought of the photo in the desk drawer, the yellow lab. She'll be okay, I said. Vivian didn't answer, but she didn't close herself off the way she usually did when anything got personal. She just stayed there, in the cold, in the dark, thinking about her dog. That was the second surprise. The second day was harder. Cold set in around dawn, a Rocky Mountain October cold that wasn't polite about it. We rationed the water. Vivian moved more carefully, and I stopped pretending not to notice the way her face changed every time she twisted wrong. Mid-morning, I made the call to go further downhill toward the creek to refill the water. I told her I'd be an hour, maybe less. I marked the trail both ways, left her the flashlight, showed her where everything was stacked, and made her promise to stay put. I don't make promises, she said. Then make an exception. She looked at me for a long beat. 1 hour, she said. I found the creek, refilled everything I could carry. On the way back, I slipped on a wet rock and went down hard on my knee and spent 3 minutes sitting in the mud talking myself into standing up again. The knee held. Barely. When I came back over the ridge and saw the boulders, she was on her feet before I was fully through the brush. You're late, she said. 20 minutes. 23. I held up the bottles. She stared at them for a second, and then she crossed the ground between us fast, took the bottles from my hands, and set them down, and then she just grabbed my jacket at the collar and held on, her forehead dropping forward against my shoulder. She didn't say anything for a moment. When she spoke, her voice was stripped of everything I'd heard in it for 9 months, the management, the professionalism, the practiced composure. Just a woman's voice, honest and quiet and exhausted. I thought something had happened to you. Slipped, I said. I'm fine. You're late. I know. Her hands were shaking. I put mine over them. We stood like that for longer than was strictly necessary. When she finally pulled back, her face was turned away for a moment, and when she turned back it was rebuilt, almost. Not quite all the way back to the office version, but partway there. Don't do that again, she said. Which part? Being late. Understood. She almost smiled, didn't quite make it, but almost. That night the temperature dropped another 10 degrees, and the shelter, which had been marginal on night 1, was losing the argument with the wind. We did the same thing we'd done before. The foil blanket around both of us, her shoulder against my arm. Practical decision, no discussion. Except this time neither of us pretended it was only practical. She talked more that night. About the division, about a project she'd fought to get funded for 3 years that had finally broken ground last spring. About her sister in Tucson who she called every Sunday morning and who she suspected was probably already panicking. About the dog again, her. I talked too, about my apartment in Portland, about the half-finished woodworking project, I'd been avoiding for 6 months, about my mom in Sacramento, who would absolutely not handle the news of a downed plane well. Dear. We talked about small things, which turned out to be the big things. The things you let slide when you think there's always more time. At some point, in the middle of the night, she said, without preamble, "You're not what I expected." What did you expect? He thought about it. Someone easier to see through. I looked at her. You never tried. No, she said, I didn't. A log shifted somewhere in the dark. The wind moved through the trees in a long, low wave. I don't let people in, she said. I know that, I've been told. More than once, by more than one person who mattered. I just decided at some point that it was easier. Cleaner, she paused. Out here, that logic doesn't hold up very well. No, I said, it doesn't. She turned toward me in the dark, and I was already looking at her. Not the version of her I'd spent 9 months learning to anticipate. Just her. Tired, honest, stripped of everything the office gave her. When she kissed me, it wasn't a conclusion. It was more like finally saying something out loud, that we'd both been thinking in different languages for longer than either of us had admitted. I kissed her back, and out there in the cold, under a foil blanket, with Montana pressing in around us, and no way to know what tomorrow looked like, it felt less like a complication, and more like the only thing that had made complete sense since the plane went down. We were rescued the next morning. I heard the helicopter first, a distant mechanical hum that I initially dismissed as my brain manufacturing what I wanted to hear. Then Vivian lifted her head and said, "Is that?" And I was already on my feet. We moved out into the most open ground we could find, maybe 30 yards from the boulders, and I tore the foil blanket into sections and waved one overhead while she shouted, her voice rough and loud in a way I'd never heard from her across a conference table. The helicopter saw us on the second pass. The rescue crew was fast, efficient, and kind in the way that professionals are kind, thorough, not warm. They checked Vivian first because of the ribs, sat her on a stretcher, and ran through a checklist with the brisk competency of people who did this regularly, and were grateful this one had a better ending than some. They checked me second, told me I was lucky. I said I knew. As they loaded us, Vivian reached across the space between us and put her hand on my arm, just for a second, just long enough to mean something. One of the crew gently redirected her to get her secured, and just like that, the world that had been only the two of us for 3 days began to let other people back in. I should have known what that meant. The hospital in Bozeman was competent and clean, and full of people in expensive clothes who showed up within hours and had titles like Senior VP of External Affairs and Director of Strategic Communications, and none of them were there to ask how I was feeling. Vivian was in a separate wing for observation. 2 cracked ribs, mild dehydration, the arm wound sutured and wrapped cleanly. I was treated for the knee, a bruised shoulder, and what the doctor cheerfully called moderate exposure. Moderate exposure. I'd spent 2 nights in October in the Montana Rockies in a shelter I built out of seat fabric and good intentions. But sure, moderate. I asked about Vivian on the first day. The nurse said she was stable and resting. I asked if I could see her. She said visitors were restricted, per medical team guidance. I asked again the next morning. A different person this time, a woman in a blazer who was very clearly not a nurse, told me Miss Cole's recovery was being managed carefully, and that my cooperation was appreciated. Cooperation. By day 3, I got a call from someone named Bradley, who said he was in employee relations and wanted to make sure I was receiving adequate support during what he called a uniquely stressful event. He asked if I'd spoken to any media, which I hadn't. He thanked me for that several times, in the specific way people thank you for things they're also indirectly warning you about. On day 4, I was discharged into a corporate apartment in downtown Bozeman, paid for through the end of the month. There was a grocery delivery waiting in the kitchen, a get-well card signed by people in the Portland office, whose names I recognized from org charts, but whose faces I couldn't place, and an envelope on the counter that contained a very thorough document from legal that used words like transition support and mutual confidentiality and going forward in the same sentence, each one doing its own careful work. I sat on the couch in that apartment with the envelope in my hands and understood exactly what was happening. Not fired, erased. Politely, expensively, with plausible deniability. I tried calling her. Went straight to voicemail, which was full. I texted the number I had used for 9 months to manage her calendar, her travel, her life. Nothing. I sent one email. The next morning I got a reply from an address I didn't recognize, from someone named Allison in legal operations, informing me that future communication regarding the incident should be directed to the appropriate company representative. The appropriate company representative. They had taken the woman who grabbed my jacket in the Montana wilderness with shaking hands and wrapped her in process so fast it was almost elegant. I didn't sign the document. I left the apartment, found a sublet in a town in the Willamette Valley I'd always meant to visit, and started the quiet, slightly disorienting business of rebuilding a life that hadn't asked to be rebuilt. The hardest part wasn't the job. Jobs exist. I found contract work inside 2 weeks, project coordination for a small engineering firm, nothing that required me to know anyone's coffee order. The hardest part was the mornings. The way a certain quality of gray light through the window reminded me of the way the sun came through the firs on the second morning, thin and cold, and somehow exactly enough. The way the silence in my sublet felt different from the silence under the boulders, which had been dense and alive and shared. I told myself she'd chosen this, that when they handed her back the polished version of her life she'd spent 19 years building, she'd looked at it and decided it was worth more than whatever had happened in 3 days in the mountains. I told myself that was probably the rational conclusion, and that I could respect it even if it hollowed something out. I'd almost made myself believe it. It was a Saturday in November, 4 weeks after the rescue, gray and drizzling in the way the Willamette Valley does best. And I was making soup from scratch because I'd decided soup was something I was going to be good at. When someone knocked on the door of my sublet. Not the landlord. The knock was different, specific. I opened the door and Vivian was standing on the front step in a dark coat, with the collar up against the rain. No driver, no assistant, no one from legal flanking her. Her hair was down. She looked like she'd driven herself here, which she never did, and like she'd been thinking the whole way about whether she was going to knock, which she clearly had. For a moment, neither of us spoke. "You found me," I finally said. She looked at me the way she'd looked at me on the second morning in the mountains, past the titles, past the 9 months of professional distance. "I run a division with 9-figure budgets," she said. "I found a sublet in the Willamette Valley." "Fair." She looked past me into the apartment. "You're cooking." "Soup." "That's very earnest." "It's a skill I'm developing." Something in her face shifted. The coat was still buttoned, the posture still straight, but underneath it I could see the version of her I'd only ever met in the mountains. She swallowed once. When she spoke again, her voice was quieter. "They told me you'd moved on," she said. "Not in those words, obviously. They used better words. They said you'd received your package and accepted the transition, and that you seemed to be doing well and that pursuing contact would likely complicate everyone's recovery." She paused. "They said it several ways, over several conversations, and each time I let them. Didn't say anything." I leaned against the doorframe and waited. "And then one morning," she said, "I was in a strategy meeting and someone asked me a question about the Meridian Group follow-up, the dinner we missed, and I answered it, completely incorrectly, and when I was done I thought, I don't care about this at all." She looked at me. "I have cared about that kind of thing for 19 years. It has genuinely mattered to me." And I sat in that meeting room and felt nothing. And the only thing I could think about was whether you had signal out here or if you were still driving to the coffee shop 3 towns over for Wi-Fi. 2 towns, I said, and it's decent Wi-Fi. Her mouth curved slightly, the tired, almost real smile I'd seen the second night under the boulders. "They weren't wrong about one thing," she said. "This is complicated. I have a board. I have a position. I have people who have built careers around the professional version of who I'm supposed to be. I know. And I came anyway." The rain had picked up. She was standing in it without seeming to notice, or maybe without caring. I stepped back from the door. "The soup needs another 20 minutes, I said. She looked at me for a long second. Then she stepped inside. She looked around the sublet. Small, a little sparse, the woodworking tools I'd finally unpacked and set up in the corner, and I watched her take it in with the same careful inventory she'd given the wreckage in the mountains. Figuring out what she had to work with. Deciding what mattered. "They're going to make this difficult," she said. Probably." Dear. And you're okay with that? Dear. I looked at her standing in my kitchen in November rain, with her hair loose, and her coat dripping slightly on the tile, and I thought about 9 months of coffee orders and flight itineraries, and never once thinking I needed to know anything more. And I thought about 3 days in the mountains that taught me I'd been wrong about that. I'm okay with that, I said. She nodded once, the way she nodded when a decision was made, and it was time to move forward, and then she sat down at my kitchen table and asked if there was enough soup for two. Dear, there was. I think about the soup a lot. That's the detail that stayed with me. Not the crash, not the mountains, not the legal envelope on the counter of a corporate apartment I never asked for. Just the soup I was making when Vivian knocked on my door, and the fact that there was enough for two. There's a version of this story where I sign the document they left on that table, where I take the transition package and the extended benefits and the carefully worded distance, and I tell myself it was 3 days in the wilderness, and people do strange things under pressure, and the rational thing is to move on. I almost told myself that. I got close, and then I thought about the way she'd grabbed my jacket with shaking hands in the middle of a Montana forest and said, "I thought you were gone." And I understood that some things don't unhappen just because a company needs them to. What I learned out there had nothing to do with survival skills. I'd built a bad shelter and taken a wrong turn and slipped on a wet rock and been 23 minutes late getting back to camp. I was not impressive by any practical measure, but I stayed honest. When Vivian asked if she looked bad, I told her she looked like she'd been in a plane crash. When she told me to bring the heavy case, I told her to leave it. When she was hurt and cold and pretending she wasn't, I said so. Not cruelly, just clearly. That's the thing I keep coming back to. That honesty, even when it's uncomfortable, is a form of respect. Maybe the deepest kind. For 9 months I'd softened everything I said to her because that was the job. And in 3 days I learned that softening things hadn't been kindness. It had been a wall I'd built to keep us both at a safe distance. Vivian had her own version of that wall. 19 years of it. And I watched the mountains take it apart piece by piece, not because she was weak, but because she was smart enough, eventually, to let them. That's the part that got me. She didn't fall apart. She chose to stop performing. There's a difference, and it takes more courage than most people understand. It would have been easier to stay behind the wall. It's always easier. She drove herself to a sublet in the Willamette Valley in the rain anyway. What I learned about myself is that I had more backbone than I'd been using. I'd spent 9 months making myself small to fit the shape of someone else's expectations, and it took a plane going down in the Rockies to remind me that I had opinions worth saying out loud. That staying quiet to keep the peace isn't actually peaceful. It's just postponed. Every time I swallowed something true to avoid making things awkward, I was choosing comfort over clarity. Out there, I couldn't afford that. Either could she. The company tried to erase what happened with clean language and a generous check. What they didn't account for is that some things change a person past the point where money is the right unit of measurement. Vivian knew that, which is why she showed up at my door. I knew it too, which is why I opened it. The soup needed 20 more minutes. She sat at the table, still in her coat, and we talked like two people who had already said the hard things and didn't need to perform anymore. That's what 3 days in the mountains had bought us. The right to just be exactly where we were. I think that's worth more than a transition package. I think it's worth almost anything.